Thank you, Brittany. Now that we've gotten some background on Switzerland, I'll talk about how to interact and communicate within the Swiss culture. I'll cover different communication concepts such as high-low context, masculinity versus femininity, individualistic versus collectivist societies, uncertainty avoidance, and power distance. Before we dive in, I'll just give a brief overview of the language and communication norms. In general, speaking English will be fine in Switzerland. Most Swiss people speak 2 of the 4 official languages plus English. Touch is not super common in interactions and communication between Swiss people, unless you know the person rather well. However, hugging is more common in the French and Italian areas of Switzerland. Last, people of Switzerland like to get to the point when they're communicating, so don't bore them with any small talk or stuff like that. Now to discuss our first more specific communication concept, we'll begin with high-low context. High-low context is how much meaning is in the words versus in nonverbal cues such as tone, facial expression, gestures, and posture. A high context culture indicates that meaning is more in these nonverbal cues. Look at this image that shows a continuum of low to high context cultures. Notice how Asian countries tend to be high context. Japan is a really good example of this. However, countries like the US and especially Switzerland are low context cultures and derive meaning from the words themselves as opposed to nonverbal cues. Much like the US, the Swiss pay little attention to these cues, and according to world business culture, Swiss people value directness before diplomacy, and they tend to speak their minds without feeling the need to spare other people's feelings. Third, as you likely know, some cultures are more masculine and some more feminine. Masculine cultures focus more on goals and power and achievement and traditional gender roles, whereas feminine cultures focus more on relationships, people getting along, and gender equality. In Switzerland, it's definitely considered more of a masculine culture than the United States, but still not quite as driven by achievements and power as countries like Hungary, Austria, and Japan. Now, power distance, what's that? Why should you be concerned about that? Power distance is the level of formality when talking about distinctions of power and class within a society. So a country with a lower power distance has a more equal distribution of power. So you might call your professor or your boss by their first name. And a culture with a high power distance indicates that there's more formality and more distinct classes of power within the culture. And one would need to take specific concern to adhere to these power and class norms. Luckily, Switzerland has a relatively low power distance when compared to other countries. Communication tends to be informal and there's not heavy distinctions between class. According to the Hofstede Power Index, Switzerland is just slightly lower power distance than the US, so not many adjustments would need to be made, not many or minor adjustments would need to be made when considering this. The last communication-related concept to discuss is the difference between an individualistic culture and a collectivist culture. Individualistic cultures, as you might have guessed, place emphasis on the individual, self-promotion, and their own personal achievements. On the contrary, collectivist cultures put the goals of the group before the individual. The way I think of this is, if Susie is extremely successful in school, an individualistic society member might say, Susie must have worked so hard on her own, she must have had all to get this personal success. And a collectivist society member would say, oh wow, Susie must have had great parents and mentors and teachers that helped her to be as successful as she is. Switzerland is considered a more individualistic culture, but still less individualistic than the United States, which is considered one of the most individualistic cultures in the world, according to the Hofstede Index. This is something to keep in mind when you travel to other countries from the US, if you're a US native, that other cultures are less individualistic than the United States. Overall, the United States and Switzerland have a lot of the same communication norms, so the adjustment shouldn't be that difficult when traveling from the United States to Switzerland. So the minute differences between the two cultures, fuck me. Okay, just stop the video.